Welcome to dark history for sleep, where the past is not forgotten and some stories were never meant to be buried. Tonight, you are standing on the frozen plains of Manchuria, winter of 1936. Bitter wind cuts through your coat. The snow crunches beneath leather boots, but not your own. You're watching them. Japanese soldiers, medical officers, and masked men building something not a hospital, not a barracks, not a base, but a lab designed for death. The locals call it Ping Fang, a quiet area near Harbin, but soon they'll learn another name whispered in fear: Unit 731, a secret branch of the Imperial Japanese Army founded under the banner of scientific progress. But its mission wasn't healing, it was biological warfare. And the test subjects, Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Koreans, Mongolians, anyone they could drag in, gagged, hooded, and chained. At the center of it all is Shirō Ishii, a man of ambition and twisted genius. He was a doctor, an officer, and a fanatic. He believed Japan needed a new kind of weapon, invisible, unstoppable, and cheap. And to perfect it, he needed experiments, hundreds, thousands, and he needed no survivors. So Unit 731 was born, a facility hidden behind medical jargon and high fences. Its outer gates claimed Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, but its chambers held steel tables, scalpels, cages of rats, and rows of test chambers lined with restraints, and prisoners, labeled not by name, but as Maruta, logs. Because to the men inside, that's all they were: material, flesh, fuel for the fire of empire. The men of Unit 731 wore white coats. They carried clipboards. They took notes with precision, their handwriting clean, their language sterile. Subject 23 expired after thoracic incision. Plague load injected, internal rupture observed. Amputation without anesthesia successful. The victims were shackled to tables, limbs stretched wide, eyes forced open. Many were healthy when they arrived. That was the point. Shirō Ishii wanted baseline data. He needed to know how a healthy body responded to collapse, how long it took a human heart to stop after freezing, how lungs drowned in blood, how organs failed one by one under strain. Vivisection became routine. Subjects were dissected alive, with no sedatives. The surgeons wanted to see natural reactions, uninterrupted by drugs. Organs were removed and studied as the victim screamed. Sometimes they removed stomachs and rerouted the intestines directly. Other times, they cut into the brain to watch conscious decline. The bodies were not buried, they were incinerated, ash scattered across frozen fields. Records show at least 3,000 people were killed this way. Some estimates rise to 10,000. The numbers may never be exact, because Unit 731 kept no graves, only data, only silence. And inside the walls, the doctors were not disturbed. There was no guilt, no pause. They believed they were serving their emperor, their nation, their science. In the cold of Ping Fang, morality froze long before the corpses did. The doctors at Unit 731 didn't just work with viruses and knives. They also worked with ice, freezing air, boiling water, human skin. The goal: to understand the full limits of the human body, specifically how cold could cripple it. Subjects, often teenage girls or farm workers, were taken outside in the middle of the night, sometimes in temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius. They were forced to expose their arms or legs. Water was poured onto the skin. The wind did the rest. In some cases, they were instructed to hold buckets of cold water again and again until the fingers turned white, rigid, and numb. Doctors would tap the limbs with wooden rods until they sounded like stone. Then the experiments began. Some limbs were thawed using heat to study blood flow, tissue death, infection rates. Others were left frozen, amputated on the spot. Still others were broken, shattered, and split while frozen solid. Each method was documented, every result compared. The subjects were not anesthetized. The pain was part of the data. Survivors? There were none. Even the ones who didn't die immediately were killed soon after. Their corpses dissected, their organs catalogued. Outside, the snow buried the screams. Inside, warmth and sake flowed among the researchers. After a long day of frostbite testing, the officers returned to their rooms to write reports, sip drinks, and prepare for the next batch. Inside Unit 731, breath was no longer a right. It was a test variable. Researchers were ordered to find the limits of lung capacity, pressure thresholds, and oxygen deprivation. So they built chambers, airtight, controlled, windowless, and they filled them with people. Some were locked inside with reduced oxygen to simulate high altitudes or suffocation. Others were placed in hyperbaric chambers, their lungs slowly crushed from the inside. Doctors observed when panic began, when the eyes rolled back, when blood vessels burst under the skin, when silence came. In one set of trials, researchers introduced gas combinations, ammonia, carbon monoxide, sulfur compounds, to test resistance and breakdown rates. Victims clawed at the steel walls, vomited blood, collapsed, and were never seen again. They were labeled by number. Their cause of death logged clinically. Subject expired at 19 minutes under gas mix, Dubar 12. These weren't just random killings. They were meant to serve Japan's military plans. Pilots needed to understand decompression. Commanders wanted gas bombs. Troops had to survive in poisoned zones. Unit 731 delivered the research at the cost of thousands of lives. But the scientists didn't think of them as people. They were units, logs, inputs and outputs. In some cases, even the families of test subjects were observed, infected together, suffocated together, to study psychological effects of shared death. It began with a needle, a restrained prisoner, a vial marked with symbols, sometimes cholera, sometimes anthrax, sometimes the bubonic plague. Then came the injection and the wait. Doctors at Unit 731 didn't just observe illness, they engineered it. Subjects were given controlled doses of diseases, adjusted for weight, age, even resistance. They were kept in cells, watched, timed, measured, fever, convulsions, organ failure, death. Then the process repeated. But this wasn't just for observation. It was for weaponization. Shirō Ishii's team designed bombs that could scatter disease over cities. They bred fleas infected with plague, housed them in ceramic bombs, and dropped them on Chinese towns. The result? Outbreaks that killed thousands without a single bullet. Entire villages were used as test sites. Aerial drops of contaminated rice, polluted wells, clothing seeded with smallpox, no warning, no treatment, no survivors. In one infamous case, a town was seeded with anthrax-laced food. Children ate it. Their intestines rotted. Their bodies were dumped into mass graves, all for research, all for empire. The data was precise. Temperature logs, infection spread rates, population collapse timelines. The more detailed the suffering, the more valuable the science. In some rooms of Unit 731, the prisoners were not alone. They were mothers, fathers, and children, locked together, not out of mercy, but for observation. One chamber might contain a man infected with plague, his wife deliberately left uninfected. Their child, exposed gradually over time, so doctors recorded who fell ill first, who comforted whom, how long the healthy resisted, how quickly love turned to helplessness. Shirō Ishii's reasoning was cold. If Japan was to unleash bioweapons in wartime, they needed to know how families collapsed under infection. So the research was made as real as possible. No sedatives, no isolation, no escape. Sometimes the mother died first. The child clung to the corpse, sobbing. Later the child's fever would spike. Then the father. Every stage was watched, every whimper documented. Other experiments forced infected parents to care for healthy children, to see if maternal instinct could overcome contagion, or if fear would lead to abandonment. When death came, it was slow, intimate, and fully recorded. When the last survivor perished, the room was cleaned, new logs prepared, another family brought in, like cattle through a slaughterhouse, but slower, and always watched. The medical staff called it group exposure studies. In truth, it was a theater of suffering, and no one in the audience ever tried to stop the show. They called it the Field Testing Division. But it was no training ground. It was a cleared patch of land, ringed with trees and barbed wire. And it had one purpose: to test weapons on living people. Subjects were tied to wooden stakes, spaced evenly apart. Then soldiers stepped back, engineers readied the weapons, and a signal was given. Grenades, rifles, flamethrowers, bombs. Each blast was recorded, each scream noted. Shirō Ishii believed Japan's weapons had to be tested on real bodies, not dummies, not animals. Only living, breathing flesh gave valid results. How deep does shrapnel penetrate? What happens when a flamethrower hits clothing first? How long does it take to die from internal bleeding after a gut wound? These were the questions, and they wanted answers. Sometimes they tested grenade fragmentation, victims tied in different positions, standing, crouched, prone. Distances varied, limbs measured post-blast. Survivors, if any, were executed afterward. Other times, it was flamethrowers, targets doused in accelerant, flame jets applied, skin melting, lungs searing, death within minutes, but not before the body convulsed violently. Even bombs meant for cities were first tested here. Aerial units dropped plague bombs to gauge infection spread. Others detonated firebombs over live clusters. Data was collected with calm professionalism, clipboards in hand, binoculars raised, timers running. And when it was done, the field was hosed down, corpses buried in mass pits, the stakes reused, a factory of death, masquerading as science. It was called field training. A final rite of passage for future doctors in the Japanese Imperial Army. Medical students, some barely 20 years old, were flown to Pingfang. They thought they were going to observe procedures, maybe assist, maybe take notes. But they were handed knives, and they were told, "You'll be operating on a prisoner alive." The prisoner was already sedated, lightly or not at all, and the operation was not to heal. It was to cut open a living body and observe. The tasks varied. Remove a kidney, cut open the stomach, extract a lung, amputate a limb, sever the spine, perform a cesarean on a conscious woman. Some were told to find and remove a beating heart. Others were ordered to induce internal bleeding, then attempt to stop it. No one was expected to succeed. It was never about survival. It was a test of obedience, efficiency, and emotional detachment. Afterward, the subject was killed, or they died on the table. Either way, the body was disposed of, the room cleaned, and the student was now a soldier of science. Many of those doctors went on to lead hospitals, run universities, live full lives. Few ever spoke of what they did. Some claimed they thought the prisoners were criminals. Others admitted they just wanted to pass. In Pingfang, mercy was failure. Conscience was weakness. Surgery was execution, and graduation was built on unmarked graves. They called the victims maruta, logs, because to Unit 731 a person was not a life, but a material unit in a system, and systems need counting. Each day began with reports. How many new subjects arrived? How many survived the night? How many expired on the table, in the field, or under gas? Each was logged by number, not name. Some records still survive. They read like inventory sheets. 3 subjects used for frostbite testing, 2 expired. 1 maruta vivisected after bacterial injection, heart removed. 4 logs incinerated. The logs didn't note gender, or age, or language, just procedure, result, disposal. The morgue was rarely empty. Bodies were stacked in coolers, limbs twisted, chests split, eyes glassy, tagged only by experiment code. If cremation furnaces backed up, corpses were buried in lime pits or dismembered and disposed in parts. Each death was planned, timed, measured. When they ran low on prisoners, fresh batches were trucked in, from nearby prisons, from raids, from villages accused of harboring dissent. Sometimes children were taken. Their tests were recorded as small maruta series. There was no moment of silence, no burial rites, just chalk marks on walls, files in drawers, and ashes in the wind. The true death toll of Unit 731 may never be known. Estimates range from 3,000 to over 10,000 direct victims. Tens of thousands more died from the outbreaks they caused. But in their records, they were just lines on paper. Lost to fire, time, and deliberate destruction. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 had perfected its weapons. They had developed bombs filled not with metal, but with fleas, feces, and plague, and they were ready to test them on a mass scale. The targets were civilian, Chinese towns, farming villages, and market cities. None of them armed, none of them warned. Japanese aircraft flew overhead. Villagers looked up. What they saw falling wasn't fire. It was ceramic spheres, fragile as porcelain. When the bombs shattered, they released fleas infected with the bubonic plague. The fleas latched onto rats, pets, livestock, and people. Within days, the infected began to vomit blood, swell with lymph nodes the size of fists, and collapse. There were no antibiotics, no doctors willing to approach. The death rate climbed. The panic spread. And all of it was recorded and analyzed by Japanese officers on the outskirts. In other cases, wells were poisoned, food dropped from planes, tainted with anthrax or cholera. Children ate first, then their families. In one town, an entire schoolhouse died within 48 hours. There were no survivors, no official warning, no one was ever held accountable. To the scientists of Unit 731, this was a triumph. They had proved that plague, delivered silently, could do more damage than bullet. They saw themselves not as monsters, but as visionaries ushering in a new era of warfare. But to the people of Manchuria, they were death in white coats, bringers of famine, rot, and ruin. And the world, for a long time, refused to look. August 1945, Japan surrenders. Cities are in ruins, camps abandoned. The Emperor speaks. The war is over. But in Pingfang, as Soviet tanks approached, the scientists of Unit 731 lit the fires. Documents were burned, hard drives smashed, rooms flooded. Prisoners, hundreds still alive, were executed en masse. Some were burned alive to ensure silence. The goal: erase everything. But not everything burned. American intelligence, already aware of rumors about Japan's biological warfare division, was watching. They knew something powerful had been created, and they wanted it. So instead of arresting Shirō Ishii, they offered him protection in exchange for all his research. Vivisection data, plague bomb designs, human trial records. In American military eyes, this was priceless intelligence, especially as tensions with the Soviets grew. So Ishii, who should have stood trial at Tokyo alongside other war criminals, was granted immunity. He lived in peace, received a pension, died in 1959, never having answered for a single death. Other doctors of Unit 731 fared just as well. Some became professors, others led hospitals. Their names faded into respectability, while their victims lay unnamed in poisoned soil across northern China. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union held its own secret trials, convicted a handful, then buried the evidence, because in the Cold War, truth was less valuable than advantage. And so, the world's greatest experiment in human horror was erased from textbooks, from headlines, from memory, not by accident, but by design. For decades, the fields outside Harbin lay quiet. No signs, no monuments, just weeds growing over what was once a laboratory of death. The locals remembered, but no one listened, and the world moved on. But silence has a limit. By the 1980s, Chinese villagers began speaking out. Old men remembered trucks in the night, missing family, sudden sickness, mass graves. One man pointed to a hill and said, "That's where they dumped the small bodies. You could hear the screams even when the wind howled." Meanwhile, researchers in Japan began to dig into forbidden archives, unmarked documents, and whispered rumors. Some found photographs, others found names, of students turned surgeons, doctors turned war criminals, living comfortably in the post-war glow. But in 1984, a former military medic admitted to being part of the program, and the world blinked. What was once dismissed as propaganda was now a matter of record. More testimonies followed. I held a child down as they injected the plague. We weren't allowed to flinch during surgery. I still see their eyes when I close mine. Yet even with these confessions, the Japanese government refused to acknowledge Unit 731. Textbooks avoided it. Court cases were dismissed. Apologies never came. In China, mass graves were uncovered. Bones piled by the hundreds, skulls shattered, rib cages cut wide open. Pingfang's foundation was still there, its walls crumbled. But the stain remained. Locals built a memorial, modest, unrecognized internationally. But for the families of the victims, it was a sacred place. Proof that they had lived, and proof that they had died for nothing but data. After Unit 731's secrets were quietly handed to the Americans, its research didn't disappear. It was studied, preserved, folded into defense reports and Cold War contingencies. In some circles, its value was openly acknowledged, not as atrocity, but as progress. This wasn't just about plague. The experiments had touched on chemical resistance, surgical techniques under extreme conditions, nerve trauma, pressure, dehydration, and starvation thresholds, human limits, documented with brutal clarity. None of it could be replicated ethically. But thanks to Unit 731, no one needed to. The data already existed. By the 1950s and 60s, as the US and USSR expanded their own biological warfare programs, traces of Ishii's work were embedded in them. Few in the public ever knew. But behind closed doors, his legacy infected the future. In 1972, the world signed the Biological Weapons Convention, banning production and use of such weapons. But the treaty lacked enforcement, and the memories of Unit 731 remained locked away. Meanwhile, rumors swirled of new secret facilities in superpower nations, places that studied toxins, viruses, and genetic sabotage, echoes of ping-fang in new uniforms. In universities, the horrors of Unit 731 finally began to enter ethical discussions. Medical schools used it as a line in the sand, what science should never become. Yet even here, some debated whether the data, however immoral, could be justified for greater good. That argument, raised even once, revealed the depth of the stain. In the world of warfare, Unit 731's lessons lingered like a dormant virus, a reminder that the greatest evils are not always committed in rage. Sometimes they are measured in spreadsheets, conducted in silence, and hidden behind titles like doctor, researcher, patriot. For decades, the world looked away. The Allies had made their deals. The Japanese government denied involvement. And the victims? They were dead, scattered, or too afraid to speak. But silence, like rot, spreads only so far, and then it breaks. In the 1990s, survivors and the families of victims began organizing. They demanded accountability, filed lawsuits in Japan, presented evidence, testimonies, photos, medical records. Many were rejected. Courts ruled that the government bore no legal responsibility. Time had passed. Documents were lost. But the pressure grew. A turning point came in 1997, when a group of Chinese plaintiffs sued the Japanese government over the use of biological weapons during the war. The Tokyo District Court acknowledged that Unit 731 had existed and had committed atrocities, but it refused to order compensation. It was a victory in name. But justice remained out of reach. In 2002, the same court ruled again. Yes, Unit 731 committed war crimes, but victims could not be individually compensated because there were no existing laws at the time of the crimes. The verdict stung. It told survivors, yes, you suffered, but no, we owe you nothing. Still, the survivors kept going. A few former doctors confessed. Old, frail, racked by guilt. One said, "We knew it was wrong, but we thought we were untouchable. We thought we were doing it for Japan." In Harbin, a museum was finally opened on the ruins of the old Pingvang facility. Rusting instruments, skeletal remains, and reconstructed chambers show visitors what denial tried to erase. Thousands come each year. Many weep, many leave silent, but they leave knowing. Outside of China, Unit 731 remains a footnote, rarely taught, seldom discussed, but those who do know understand what it represents, not just what Japan did, but what any nation can do when power, science, and cruelty are given permission to merge. Genocide. The word is sharp, charged, and carries the weight of intention. It means the destruction of a people by race, religion, nationality, or ethnicity. So was Unit 731 a genocide? Or was it something worse? A horror that evades definition? The victims were not all of one group. Yes, many were Chinese, peasants, rebels, prisoners of war. But there were also Koreans, forcibly taken from their homes, Mongolians, captured during skirmishes, Soviet prisoners, used as disposable bodies, even Japanese dissenters condemned for knowing too much. This was not racial extermination. It was utilitarian slaughter, death not as punishment, but as raw material. Historians debate the classification. Some insist it fits within genocide's frame, a state targeting civilians for destruction. Others argue it's more aligned with crimes against humanity, systematic, state-sponsored, and industrialized. But ask a survivor or the child of a victim, and they'll tell you the label doesn't matter. The horror was real, the suffering total, and the silence, the longest wound of all. Unit 731 was not about extermination. It was about dehumanization, turning people into logs, reducing bodies to test cases, making cruelty a standard operating procedure. There was no hate in the knife, only indifference, and sometimes that's more terrifying. To this day, no one has been formally charged with crimes related to Unit 731 in a recognized international tribunal. No Nuremberg, no Tokyo trials for Pingfang, just whispers, denials, and dusty archives. But the truth leaks through, in textbooks revised under pressure, in testimonies recorded before death, in exhibitions quietly placed in museums, a slow, persistent drip of memory that refuses to dry. Unit 731 did more than murder. It set a precedent. It showed the world what's possible when science is stripped of conscience. And though its crimes are buried, its methods, its logic, still flicker in the dark corners of human progress. That in 2003, when SARS swept across Asia, Chinese media briefly resurfaced Unit 731. The panic triggered a question. Was this a biological experiment gone wrong? The answer, of course, was no. But the fear, it came from a place of memory. People hadn't forgotten that in this very region, just 60 years earlier, bacteria were weaponized and dropped from planes. That truth remains part of the air they still breathe. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic gripped the planet, conspiracies spread faster than the virus, and once again, Unit 731 re-entered the conversation. A ghost from the past, whispering warnings about labs, viruses, and state secrecy. The actual science is different. Modern labs operate under tight scrutiny. But the fear remains. What if there's another Pingfang somewhere? What if another Ishii walks free in a lab coat? Because Unit 731 wasn't just about Japan. It was about what people will justify in the name of victory, research, or survival. Well, today, international protocols exist. Ethics boards, treaties, watchdog agencies. But even now, some nations still develop bioweapons in silence. They call them deterrents. They test them in deserts, in jungles, away from headlines. And always, Unit 731 is the shadow in the back of every risk assessment. In ethics courses across the globe, future scientists are shown the case of Unit 731. They read the testimonies, they see the photos, and they ask the question, how could people do this? But the better question is, how do we make sure it never happens again? Because every experiment is a choice, and every Petri dish carries the memory of what once was done in Manchuria. Shirō Ishii was not a beast. He was charismatic, intelligent, well-educated, a man who believed he was doing something great. And that's what made him so dangerous. He spoke not of torture, but of medical necessity. He didn't see the prisoners as human beings. He saw them as logs, test materials. He once said, "To win future wars, we must master invisible weapons." He believed disease was the future of combat, and he believed Japan deserved to own that future. The doctors under him. Many were young, fresh from university, told they were part of something patriotic, important. When asked years later why they cut open living people, some said, "We thought they were criminals. We had no choice. It was for the empire." But more often, they said nothing, because they didn't feel guilty, only afraid of being caught. The language used inside Unit 731 was designed to erase morality. There were no people, only subjects, only data, only outcomes. Death was not death. It was expiration. Pain was not pain. It was stimulus response. And by the time the knife entered flesh, the soul of the surgeon was already long gone. They played music during operations, laughed in mess halls, held promotions and award ceremonies, because to them, this wasn't a slaughterhouse. It was a laboratory. They believed they were the pioneers of a cleaner war, no bullets, just biology. Years later, when some were interviewed, they looked confused, disoriented by the idea that the world saw them as evil, because they had compartmentalized it so completely. Built walls in their minds as strong as the walls around Ping Fang. And behind those walls, they had convinced themselves they were the good guys. In Harbin, the wind still howls across the plains where Ping Fang once stood. There are no screams now, only tourists, memorial plaques, and silence. But beneath the surface, the ground remembers. The children of survivors, some now in their 60s and 70s, grew up in villages built on mass graves. They were told stories in whispers. Your uncle never came back from the truck. Your grandmother was taken for medicine. That hill over there, don't dig. Many developed health issues, cancer clusters, birth defects. Some blame genetics, others blame what was poured into the rivers, the soil, the air. In Japan, a different silence reigns. Unit 731 is not in most textbooks. It is not taught in schools. Few monuments exist. No national apology has ever been issued. And when survivors or their descendants petition for justice, they are often met with denial or quiet legal rejection. For China, Unit 731 is a scar woven into national memory. For Japan, it is a shadow best left undisturbed. The result? Generational rage, a diplomatic coldness, and a cultural tension that resurfaces every time war crimes are discussed. Documentaries have been made, books written, museums built. But the story still feels incomplete, because the perpetrators were never punished, because justice was traded for knowledge, and because the world moved on with too much haste. For those who lived through it, and for those who carry their blood, Unit 731 is more than history. It's a question mark, a moral riddle, a whisper in the wind that asks, what will you do if it happens again? Unit 731 didn't emerge from chaos. It came from structure, from laboratories, universities, grant funding, uniforms. It was organized evil, done not in rage, but in rational, bureaucratic efficiency. That's what makes it so dangerous. Today, we like to think we are immune to such horrors, that science is ethical, that governments are restrained, that the internet, whistleblowers, and human rights treaties would prevent it all. But every part of Unit 731 was justified by those in power. They believed it was national security. They believed they were saving lives by taking others. They believed the enemy was less than human. And those beliefs still exist in every corner of the modern world. You don't need a war to create atrocity. You only need an ideology strong enough, a science ambitious enough, a population distracted enough, and a government willing to look the other way. Around the world today, there are still secret labs, still experiments done in the name of progress, still prisoners with no rights, still regimes that silence dissent and call it peace. We don't always know what happens in those locked rooms. We just hope they don't follow the blueprint laid out in Ping Fang. The lessons of Unit 731 aren't just about war crimes. They're about the fragility of ethics. How easily doctors can become torturers. How quickly data can drown out empathy. How science, when severed from morality, becomes a scalpel without a surgeon. To ensure it never happens again, we must remember it fully, not sanitize it, not excuse it, not hide it. Because behind every future breakthrough, behind every sealed door, there's a question. What price was paid? And who paid it? Harbin has grown. It's a modern city now, bustling, bright, alive. But in the southern outskirts, near the ruins of the old Ping Fang compound, locals know better than to dig too deep. Because every few years, a child finds a bone. A construction crew hits a rib cage. A farmer turns up a femur with clean surgical cuts still etched into it. There are still graves that haven't been uncovered, mass pits filled with bodies discarded after vivisection, weapon testing, or frostbite exposure. Some are so shallow that storms bring fragments to the surface. The land is trying to remember what the world has tried to forget. In 2011, a new mass grave was uncovered. Hundreds of bones. Most were from teenagers, likely abducted villagers or prisoners. Their remains were quietly catalogued. A few headlines appeared. Then, silence. The Japanese government still refuses official recognition. It issues no apology, pays no reparations, and teaches none of it in schools. To the survivors, this is salt in the wound. To the victims' families, this is the final cruelty, that after death, even truth is denied. The Unit 731 Museum in Harbin remains open, run not by world organizations, but by locals and a handful of dedicated historians. Inside are the tools, the clamps, the tanks, the jars, the surgical saws, all displayed quietly. No dramatics, because the truth is already dramatic enough. And still bones are waiting. Still some names are unknown. Still the full record is hidden in military vaults and burned pages. Still the world has not held its breath long enough to truly listen. Some say we study history to learn, others to mourn. But there's another reason, one far heavier. We study history to remember what silence costs. Unit 731 is not just a crime, it's a mirror. A reflection of what happens when power meets apathy, when science forgets its soul, and when nations decide that some lives are data. It reminds us that atrocity is rarely loud. It is quiet, efficient, filed away in drawers labeled confidential. The people who worked there weren't demons. They were normal, doctors, researchers, soldiers, husbands, sons, and that's the part that hurts the most, because it means any system can fail this way. It only takes the right conditions, the right justification, the right kind of fear. We like to imagine ourselves better now, smarter, more ethical. But the records of Unit 731 weren't destroyed because they were wrong. They were destroyed because they were useful. And usefulness, in the hands of the powerful, will always outweigh justice if no one is watching. So the lesson here is not just to remember. It's to remain vigilant, to ask, what are we excusing today? What are we not being told? What price are others paying for our safety, our knowledge, our progress? Because Unit 731 didn't end. It just changed names, and its legacy still walks quietly through sterile corridors and locked doors. Trauma doesn't end with the victim, it echoes. Through sons and daughters, through lullabies left unsung, through the empty chairs at dinner tables that no one dares speak of. And the legacy of Unit 731 is not confined to textbooks. It's alive in those who inherited the silence. For decades, children of survivors in northern China grew up with unspoken rules. Don't ask what happened in 42. Don't talk about the brother who vanished. Don't dig too deep near the edge of town. They knew, without being told, that something had been taken, that their families had been altered by an evil no one wanted to name. Some grew curious. They became historians, archivists, activists, and in their research, they found the truth. They found photos of shackles, knives, bodies on tables. They found testimonies from surgeons who once lived next door, and then they understood why their parents flinched at sirens, why certain scars were never explained, why the village well was always spoken of with dread. In Japan, another kind of silence grew. The children and grandchildren of Unit 731 personnel often knew nothing. Their fathers were doctors, veterans, quiet men who smoked too much and kept their medals in drawers. Some families found out by accident. An old uniform, a name mentioned in a book, a photo with a chilling background. The confrontation was internal. Was my grandfather a war criminal? Did he ever talk about Harbin? Was it really just research? Some denied it, some confessed, most simply changed the subject, because no one wants to believe they come from a legacy of torture. But the bloodline remembers, even when the mind tries to forget. And so, the trauma spreads, not just in the hearts of survivors, but in the unspoken inheritance of those born decades later. Not scars on flesh, but scars on truth. Some atrocities are remembered, others are erased, not because they were smaller, not because they were less cruel, but because someone decided they were inconvenient. Unit 731 isn't in most school curriculums. It's absent from many war memorials. And when people do hear about it, it's often dismissed as rumor, propaganda, or unverified history. Why? Because at the end of the war, no one wanted accountability. The Americans wanted data. The Soviets wanted deniability. Japan wanted to forget. And so they made a trade, no trials, in exchange for silence. The files were split between superpowers, the bodies burned, the doctors protected, and the narrative intentionally was kept vague. In Japan, Unit 731 survivors and historians have struggled for decades against institutional resistance. Lawsuits have been thrown out, public exhibits shut down, journalists warned, professors dismissed. Even now, speaking openly about Unit 731 in Japan can be a career-ending move. Because if the nation accepts this history, it must also accept who was allowed to walk free. In the West, the story is often overshadowed by the Holocaust, the atomic bombings, and the battles of the Pacific. Unit 731 isn't less important. It's just less comfortable. It implicates not just the Axis, but the Allies who chose secrecy over justice. In China, the memory survives more vividly, but often through nationalist framing. It's presented not just as a tragedy, but as a wound inflicted by foreign cruelty. And while that's true, it can also obscure the human dimension beneath the political one. So the story stays underground, whispered, fragmented, denied, but not forgotten, because some truths refuse to stay buried. The Pingfang district, a suburb of Harbin in northeastern China. Today it looks like any other industrial town. Concrete roads, gray skies, warehouses, apartments, market stalls. But beneath the asphalt lies a different world. The ghost of a compound that once covered 6 square kilometers. Unit 731 had it all. A power plant, a living vivisection wing, bacterial production lines, a frostbite experimentation chamber, burn pits, and a crematorium, none of it built in secret. Thousands of locals saw it. Most said nothing, because to speak was to vanish. But after Japan's surrender, the facility was rigged for destruction. Fires were set, walls blown, bodies incinerated, but not everything burned. Some buildings were too solid, too important, too embedded. Their foundations survived. And in the 1980s, archaeologists and survivors began to dig. What they found defied even their worst fears. Rusting surgical equipment, chains, scalpels, bone saws, concrete tanks used for freezing tests. In one chamber, dozens of human remains were uncovered, some with their skulls sawed open, others still shackled at the wrist. All of it had been left behind, as if the dead would never be found. Today, part of the old complex has been transformed into the Unit 731 Museum. Its walls are spare, its exhibits stark. They don't dramatize, they don't sensationalize, because they don't need to. The truth is already unbearable. Yet most of the facility still lies buried beneath the surrounding neighborhoods. Locals know not to dig too far. There are still rumors of plague spores in the soil, of bones in basements, of whispers in the wind when night falls too quiet. Wupingfang isn't a ruin. It's a mass grave disguised as a town, and every time it rains, the past seeps closer to the surface. After World War II, the world held its breath, and its breath turned to rage. The Holocaust was exposed. The Nuremberg trials were convened. Generals and executioners were made to stand and answer. But for Unit 731, there was no Nuremberg. There was no reckoning. General Shirō Ishii, the man who designed and led the operation, was never arrested, never charged, never even cross-examined. He offered the U.S. government a deal. In exchange for full disclosure of Unit 731's research, he and his staff would receive immunity. The Americans accepted. They didn't care about the bodies. They cared about the data. Not just medical logs, but charts on how long a man can survive with frostbitten lungs, how many plague fleas it takes to infect a population, what the human heart does when sliced open without anesthesia. This was information the US didn't have, information the Soviets wanted. And in the early Cold War, that made it currency. As a result, Ishii lived a quiet life. He gave lectures under a fake name, retired peacefully, died in 1959 with honors, with savings, with secrets intact. The same went for his staff. Dozens of doctors, researchers, and commanders slipped back into civilian life. Many became respected physicians. Some led prestigious hospitals. Others taught new generations of doctors without ever mentioning what they did in Manchuria. A few confessed in old age, most didn't. Compare that to Nazi war criminals, public trials, executions, lifelong disgrace. But with Unit 731, the files were locked, the names redacted, the deals made behind closed doors. Some tried to change that. In the 1990s, survivors filed lawsuits. Historians demanded transparency. A few Japanese veterans came forward in shame, but the government still refused to prosecute, still denied responsibility, and so justice died the same way the victims did, in a quiet, sealed room with no witnesses. if Unit 731 had been exposed, prosecuted, publicly condemned. It might have faded into memory like other war crimes, but instead it became something worse, a secret, a lie, a shared silence that breeds resentment across borders. In China, Unit 731 is a story told with bitterness. It's taught in schools, shown in documentaries, used as a symbol of foreign cruelty and betrayal. Every denial from Japan only deepens the anger. Every uncovered grave is another wound reopened. In South Korea, it's part of a wider pattern, a long list of unacknowledged war crimes, from forced labor to sexual slavery to biological testing. And every time Japan denies responsibility, the region tenses. In Japan, the story remains fragmented. Some citizens are horrified. They march for recognition. They demand education reform. But others cling to national pride, fearing that acknowledgement means shame, guilt, or weakness. And so, the subject is avoided. The result is a region still scarred by the past, diplomatic meetings that collapse over history, trade deals threatened by textbooks, apologies issued, then walked back under pressure. Unit 731 is not just a chapter, it's a ghost in the room during every major negotiation between East Asian powers. This unresolved history has real consequences. Military tensions rise. Nationalist movements gain strength. Young people inherit hate without fully knowing its origins. And beneath it all is the simple truth. The dead were never buried properly, and the crimes were never confessed. Unit 731 didn't just destroy bodies. It damaged trust, it poisoned memory, and it ensured that even in peace, the war never fully ended. Most of Unit 731's victims were never identified. They were peasants, prisoners of war, political dissidents, children pulled off the street, criminals, civilians, farmers, foreigners. To the doctors, they were just case numbers, experiment logs. Logs in their cold, dehumanizing slang. But to someone, they were everything. The many families never received bodies, no confirmation, no remains, just a knock on the door. Or sometimes nothing at all. Some still wait. They write letters, they attend memorials, they wander the grounds of Harbin hoping for a sign. A fragment of bone, a familiar name in an old file, a ghost. There are few statues, no global day of remembrance, no solemn halls of memory like those built for other atrocities, only local shrines, private museums, plaques carved in sorrow by those who refuse to let the story die. But the silence is breaking, slowly. Each year, more survivors' families come forward. More students research. More journalists ask the uncomfortable questions. In 2018, China declassified new documents related to the experiments. In 2021, the Harbin Museum expanded, with new exhibits based on forensic evidence. In Japan, a few professors and activists continue to risk careers by teaching the truth. The victims deserve more, but at least now, there are names on walls, testimonies in archives, and stories being told, like this one. They may never receive justice, but they will not be erased. They lived, they suffered, and now they are remembered. History isn't a warning, it's a mirror. And when we stare into Unit 731, we don't just see the past, we see the present, and what the future could become if we aren't watching closely enough. Could it happen again? Yes, because the tools are still here. The logic still works. And the systems that protect people are only as strong as the people running them. We already have governments that suppress dissent, laboratories with little oversight, scientists trained to obey, not question, nationalist ideologies that demand sacrifice for the greater good. And above all, we have fear. Fear of war, fear of enemies, fear of weakness. Fear makes people do terrible things. The line between research and cruelty isn't drawn in ink. It's drawn in ethics, which can be erased with just the right emergency, just the right war, just the right lie. We already know how it starts. A facility built in secret. A staff told they're doing something important. A government promising protection. A public too distracted or too afraid to look. And then dehumanization, classification, reduction, erasure until once again someone stands over a body with a scalpel and says, "It's not a person, it's data." The only way to stop it is to tell the story, to speak the names, to remember the pain, to refuse to let silence win. Because Unit 731 wasn't inevitable, it was a choice. And choices can be made again. Unless we're watching, unless we remember, unless we say, never again. Survivors of Unit 731 are few. Most were killed, their bodies destroyed, their names erased from records. But a handful, very few, escaped. Some because they were overlooked, some because they were used and then discarded, and a few because they were children. Too young to dissect, too small to notice. They told their stories decades later. Some only spoke once. Some wrote letters never sent. Others whispered their memories to family on their deathbeds. But the stories came out, enough to piece together the map of horrors. They remembered the smell of formaldehyde, the scream of metal doors, the way the nurses smiled like everything was normal even as people disappeared down corridors. They remembered the eyes of the men in white coats, not angry, not cruel, just cold. One woman, a child from a nearby village, recalled being taken to the compound. They drew her blood, measured her limbs, then sent her away. She said she never understood why, until her brother vanished the next week. He never came home. These last witnesses carried the burden of memory alone. They were often not believed or dismissed as propaganda or told politely to let the past rest. But they didn't. They spoke, and in doing so, they cracked the silence. Today, recordings of their voices play in small exhibits, on underground websites, in banned documentaries. Their words are clear. We were not enemies. We were not soldiers. We were just there. In a world where most perpetrators of Unit 731 died without consequence, justice has taken a different form. It is not found in courts, not in verdicts, but in remembrance. The truth, preserved and repeated, is the only sentence that history allows. Activists in China, Japan, and South Korea have spent decades fighting for that truth. They hold memorials in Pingfang, they build archives, they write books, film documentaries, and confront officials who'd rather forget. They do it for the victims, but also for the future. Because if these horrors are buried, they will return, wearing different uniforms, speaking different languages, but carrying the same scalpel. In Japan, some younger generations are beginning to ask, what did my grandfather do in the war? Why is this not in my textbook? Why is there a shrine, but no apology? A quiet reckoning grows, small but real. University students protest whitewashed history. Professors risk careers to tell the full story. Artists and filmmakers create works that speak where politics refuse to. In China, a new wave of education ensures that Unit 731 is not forgotten. Children visit the museum in Harbin. They hear survivor recordings. They write poems. lay flowers, and learn what was done to people just like them. It's not perfect, it's not always apolitical, but it is remembrance, and that, at least, is sacred. There's no closure, no restored balance, but there is this, a record, a voice, a refusal. Unit 731 did everything it could to erase its crimes, but in the cracks of history, in the voices that won't stop telling, justice still lives. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. We like to think evil is rare, obvious, grotesque. But the truth is colder. Most atrocities aren't committed by monsters. They're committed by men in white coats, pressed uniforms, and clean offices. Men who clock in, follow orders, and clock out, just like anyone else. Unit 731 didn't recruit sadists. It recruited scientists, doctors, bright minds from Japan's top universities, men who believed in medicine, in discipline, in serving their country. And that belief, not hatred, not cruelty, but belief, was the engine of everything they did. They were told, the prisoners are criminals. This will save Japanese lives. You are doing vital work. This is war. And with each new order, each new corpse, the line between right and wrong blurred. Until one day, cutting open a conscious man was just another assignment. Psychologists call this moral disengagement. It's not a switch, it's a slow process. Rename the victims, reframe the purpose, reassign the blame. And soon you're not doing something wrong, you're doing your job. That's the true horror. That no one at Unit 731 thought they were the villain. They thought they were professionals, patriots, innovators. They didn't lose their souls in a fire. They signed them away with paperwork. And if it happened once, it can happen again. That's the final warning of Ping Fang. Not just that evil exists, but that it wears a name tag and smiles politely and goes home to its family at the end of the day. There's a reason most people have never heard of Unit 731. It's too much, too graphic, too disturbing, too easy to ignore. It's easier to learn about battles, about generals, about strategy and victories. But this is the part of history that doesn't come with closure, or a moral, or redemption, just ash and bones and silence. But that silence is a trap. Because if we turn away, so will the next generation. And then it happens again. Not the same uniforms, not the same flag, but the same mindset, the same cold justifications. So we remember, not for punishment, not for vengeance, but because someone must. Someone must say the names that were never spoken, must hold the memories of those who were denied graves, must carry the flame through the darkness so that it doesn't go out. If you've made it this far, you've already done something rare. You've looked, listened, faced something most people never will. That matters. You are now part of the record, part of the resistance to forgetting. Unit 731 thrived in silence, so the only justice left is sound, words, stories, truth, spoken again and again, until even the dead can hear it. We want to believe evil comes from bad people, that if we just punish the wrongdoers, we prevent it from happening again. But Unit 731 didn't come from evil men. It came from an evil system. A system that rewarded obedience over empathy, secrecy over honesty, progress over humanity. A system where doctors answered to generals. Morality was overwritten by hierarchy. Victims became variables. Truth was buried under national interest. And systems like that still exist. Not always in the open, not always in war, but anywhere people are told to follow orders without question, to dehumanize the other, to prioritize results over lives. That's where it begins. Unit 731 didn't need hate to thrive. It needed compliance. That's why remembrance matters, not just as mourning, but as defense. When we study atrocities, we don't just honor the dead. We train our instincts. We teach ourselves to recognize the signs of rot, to ask questions when others stay silent, to refuse orders that come wrapped in flags. And we teach our children that science without conscience is just a sharper knife. That knowledge without accountability can become a weapon. That evil isn't a man in a uniform, it's a meeting, a memo, the budget line, an unchecked assumption that someone else is less than human. Unit 731 was not the first. It was not the last. Across time, across continents, the same story repeats. Science, twisted. Bodies, broken. Truth, hidden. In Nazi Germany, doctors experimented on prisoners with poison gas, hypothermia, sterilization, and surgeries without anesthesia. They too kept records, charts, footage for research. In the United States, the Tuskegee experiment allowed black men to die of untreated syphilis so doctors could observe natural progression. No consent, no treatment, just silence. In South Africa, the apartheid regime tested chemical weapons on political prisoners. In Soviet psychiatry, dissidents were labeled insane, imprisoned, and drugged. In North Korea, there are rumors, too grim to confirm, of human testing camps still active today. These are not the same atrocities, but they grow from the same root, a belief that some lives don't count, that progress is more important than pain, that the greater good justifies anything. Unit 731 is not just a horror story. It's a case study in how quickly knowledge becomes cruelty when we stop asking, should we? And it's a reminder that the past is never truly past, because we are still writing new records, still conducting experiments, still walking the line between innovation and inhumanity. You've spent hours in the shadows, listened to unspeakable things, faced the rot beneath the surface of history, and now you carry something, not trauma, but truth. Truth is heavier than fear. It lingers. It interrupts silence, and in stories like this, it becomes a kind of resistance, because we don't tell these stories to wallow in pain. We tell them so the silence does not win. When Unit 731 buried its victims, it tried to bury the story too. Erase the records, burn the buildings, silence the witnesses, but the ground remembers, and so do we. It matters that you heard this, because every listener is a witness, and every witness is one more link in the fragile chain that keeps truth alive. There is no monument big enough for the lives lost, no justice that can ever balance the scales, but there is still memory, and that's how we honor them, by refusing to look away, by refusing to forget, by telling the story again and again, until even the bones in the ground know they are not alone. Some names are never written down, some stories are never told, but they matter, because a human life is not measured in numbers or charts or data. It is measured in presence, in memory, in who chooses to carry it forward. Thousands died at Unit 731, not in battle, not in resistance, but on steel tables, in sealed rooms, under cold fluorescent lights. They were not heroes. They were not martyrs. They were victims, forgotten by most, buried without names, used, discarded, erased, until now. You've walked through their story, felt the weight of what was done, faced the faces they were denied, and by doing so, you've given them something more powerful than justice. You remembered them. Let that be enough for now. Let the silence that follows be sacred, not empty. Let the darkness be a space where truth still breathes. And when you turn off the light, when you drift into sleep, know this. You carry a truth that once had no voice. And because of that, it lives on